It started when I took a break from everything. I'd been working too much, barely sleeping, not eating right, and always staring at a screen. My doctor told me I was burning out and needed to get away. I remembered an old family friend who had a cabin deep in the woods near the Canadian border, a few hours' drive from where I lived. It was empty most of the time. I asked if I could stay there for a week or two, just to breathe, think, and get back to myself. He said yes. I packed my car with supplies, non-perishable food, water, a few changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, a small hatchet, and a basic toolkit. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water, but it was stocked with firewood and had a hand pump outside for water. I liked the idea of roughing it. I needed that quiet. No noise, no calls, no emails. Just me and nature. The drive was long. I didn't see a single gas station or store after the last small town. The road narrowed to a single lane, half gravel and half dirt, winding through thick forest. It was mid-October and the trees were at peak color. Reds, oranges, and yellows stretched in every direction. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It looked exactly like I remembered, small, weathered, a little crooked in spots, with a porch that sagged slightly. The forest wrapped tightly around it, the nearest neighbor miles away. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked, aired out the cabin, and got a small fire going in the old iron stove. It took a while to warm up, but once it did, the place felt cozy. I ate a can of chili and some crackers, then read a book by flashlight before falling asleep early. It was the first full night of sleep I'd had in weeks. The next morning, I went for a walk. I didn't have a cell signal anymore, so I used a compass and kept track of landmarks. I wandered for hours, breathing in the crisp air and letting my thoughts settle. I saw deer tracks, squirrels darting through leaves, and once, a distant moose standing in a clearing. Everything was still, peaceful. I came back to the cabin tired but calm. That night, I built a bigger fire, cooked some rice and beans, and listened to the wind outside. The creaking of the trees became like a lullaby. The third night is when things started to feel different. I had just settled into my sleeping bag when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft, repetitive crunch. Leaves, someone or something walking. I froze, listening. It stopped after a minute. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. I went back to sleep. But the next morning, I found something strange. Near the pump, there were footprints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. A single set. They weren't mine. I'd worn hiking boots with a different tread. These were different, wider, more worn, the kind of heavy work boots someone might wear in construction. They led from the tree line to the pump and then vanished back into the forest. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here? No cars had come down the road. I would have heard them, and the nearest town was hours away. I felt unsettled but told myself it could have been an old track, maybe from a hunter passing through days earlier. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood, cooked, and wrote in my notebook. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something about those prints stuck with me. That night, I kept the hatchet by my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. No noise, just a feeling, like something had changed. I sat up and listened. Then I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside, moving slowly, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps were steady, careful, not rushed. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. Silence. I waited. I don't know how long. My heart was pounding. Eventually, I heard the steps again, but now they were moving away, toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. I didn't hear them again. In the morning, I stepped outside, hatchet in hand. The footprints were back. Same boots. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and returned to the trees. I checked everything, doors, windows, the woodpile. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. But someone had been here. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and heading back. But something in me didn't want to run. I wanted to figure out what was going on. So I stayed. I spent the day preparing, sharpening the hatchet, reinforcing the door with some extra wood, setting up a small perimeter with string and empty cans that would make noise if someone tripped them. I felt ridiculous, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore the unease. That night, I stayed awake. No fire, no light. I sat near the window, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening. It was after midnight when I heard it again. Slow, steady footsteps. Then a pause. Then the sound of a can tipping over. My trap had worked. I held my breath. The steps moved again, now quicker, heading toward the back of the cabin. I shifted to the rear window and saw a faint silhouette, just a shape between the trees. They weren't approaching anymore, just standing there, watching. I stayed there for hours. Eventually, the figure moved. I heard more footsteps fading into the woods. When morning came, I checked outside. The can was on the ground, the string broken. More boot prints. This time they went deeper into the woods, not toward the road, not toward any path I knew. I decided to follow them. I waited until mid-morning, then packed a small bag, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, the hatchet. I followed the prints into the trees. They wound between the trunks, over fallen logs, across shallow creeks. I kept checking my compass and marking trees with bits of fabric from a torn bandana so I wouldn't get lost. I followed the tracks for over an hour before I found something. It was a small clearing hidden behind a wall of pine trees, and in the middle of it was a makeshift shelter. Not a tent, more like a lean-to made of logs and a tarp. There were signs of a small fire pit, long cold. An old metal pot hung from a branch. A few cans of food, mostly empty, were scattered nearby, and there was a sleeping bag rolled up and damp. Whoever had been staying there wasn't there now. But it was recent, fresh. The prints I'd followed led straight here. I checked around the shelter but didn't touch anything. It didn't feel right. I had no idea who this person was or why they'd been circling my cabin, but I didn't want to wait around and find out. I followed my markers back to the cabin. The whole time I felt watched, like something or someone was just beyond my view. I didn't run. I just walked fast, head on a swivel. I made it back by afternoon and immediately packed my gear. I left nothing behind. By the time I reached the car, the sun was already dipping. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror more than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Back in the city, I didn't tell many people about it. Just my brother and one close friend. I didn't report it to the police. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin at night? That I found a campsite in the woods? It wasn't illegal, just disturbing. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online, trying to find stories about people living off the grid in that region. I found a few mentions: loners, hermits, people who chose to disappear. Some were harmless. Some had a history of mental illness or criminal records. One article mentioned a man who'd been living in the forest for years, stealing supplies from cabins. He was never caught. I don't know if it was him. I never saw a face, just a shape, just the prints, just that feeling. But I never went back to the cabin. I didn't need to. I'd gone there to find peace. What I found instead was a reminder that the world isn't empty, even in the deepest woods. That silence doesn't always mean you're alone, and that not all dangers are loud or obvious. Some walk slowly, carefully, just beyond the light, waiting for the moment you stop paying attention. I pay attention now. Every noise, every track. When I hike, I always turn around, make sure I'm not being followed. I lock my doors even in the middle of nowhere, and I never camp alone anymore. It was late October when I finally decided to take a break from everything. I had been working nonstop for the past few years, stuck behind a desk, dealing with clients, meetings, emails, and deadlines. I didn't realize how drained I had become until I started having trouble sleeping and waking up with headaches almost every day. One afternoon, after another long Zoom call, I just sat in my apartment staring at the wall and realized I couldn't keep going like this. I needed to get away for a while, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the city. I started looking for cabins online, and after scrolling through dozens of listings, I found one that caught my attention. It was located deep in the woods of northern Michigan, about 4 hours from where I lived. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, a small lake nearby, and not a single other house in sight. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell reception. It was perfect. I booked it for 10 days, packed a few bags with clothes, some canned food, a couple books, and drove up early the next morning. The roads got narrower the deeper I went, and after a while, they turned to gravel. Eventually, even my GPS stopped working, so I followed the written directions the cabin owner had emailed me. The forest grew denser as I drove further in. The trees leaned over the road, casting shadows that made it feel later than it really was. I passed a few old, rusted signs and one abandoned-looking barn, but otherwise, I didn't see a single person. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was just as the pictures had shown. Small, wooden, and surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. There was a small porch with a couple of worn-out chairs and a wooden table. The door creaked when I opened it, and the inside smelled faintly of old wood and smoke. There was a fireplace in the corner, a single bed pushed against the back wall, a tiny kitchenette with a few pans and dishes, and a small bathroom with just a sink and toilet. No shower, no heater besides the fireplace. I unpacked my stuff, started a fire in the fireplace using the chopped wood stacked beside it, and heated up a can of soup for dinner. That night, I sat on the porch with a flashlight and read for a while until the cold became too much. Then I went inside, crawled into bed, and fell asleep quicker than I had in months. The next few days passed slowly, which was exactly what I needed. I spent my time walking through the woods, gathering firewood, reading, and cooking simple meals. The quiet was the kind that wraps around you, the kind you don't realize you've been missing until you're surrounded by it. There were no cars, no voices, no buzzing phones. Just the wind in the trees, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional bird or squirrel. I started to feel like myself again. But around the fourth night, things started to feel off. It began with little things. That night, I had gone out to the lake just before sunset. I sat by the water for about an hour, watching the light change on the surface. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed the front door was slightly open. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't closed it properly, but I clearly remembered hearing the latch click when I locked it. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind, though it hadn't felt windy at all. I checked the cabin, but nothing seemed touched or out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I locked the door again and placed one of the heavy dining chairs in front of it, just to be sure. That night, I kept waking up to every little sound. The wind outside, creaks in the wood, something scratching faintly against the walls. I told myself it was just animals or the wood settling, but the feeling that something wasn't right wouldn't go away. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Not animal prints, boots. They circled the cabin, stopped by the windows, and continued toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, following the prints until they disappeared into the woods. I didn't go far. I didn't want to lose sight of the cabin. I felt exposed out there, like someone might be watching. That day, I stayed inside mostly. I kept the fire going and moved one of the chairs in front of the window so I could watch the front yard. Every so often, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but I couldn't be sure. My brain kept trying to rationalize things. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe it was the cabin owner checking in. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There had been no knock on the door, no car sounds, and those footprints. Who walks quietly around someone's cabin at night and peers into their windows? That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going just for the light. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up suddenly to a soft, deliberate creaking sound. It was coming from the porch. My heart slammed in my chest. I lay completely still, listening. The sound came again, creak, then another, slow, like someone was shifting their weight. I slowly sat up and looked toward the window. The firelight was faint, but I could still make out the edge of the porch. I thought I saw a shadow move across it. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the sound stopped. I waited another half hour before I got up and checked the door. Still locked. I didn't open it. The next morning, I found more footprints, fresh ones. They led from the woods to the porch, then back again. That was it. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed my bag, loaded everything into the car, and tried to start it. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time trying to calm down. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe I left the lights on. Maybe the cold drained the battery. But the timing felt wrong. Too specific. Someone had been walking around the cabin every night. Now suddenly I couldn't leave? I went back inside, grabbed the axe I'd used for firewood, and sat by the window again. I didn't know what else to do. I spent the day on edge, staring into the woods, listening to every sound. I barely ate, just waited. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the axe across my lap, watching the door. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. This time, there was no doubt. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate. I held my breath. The doorknob turned slightly, then again, slowly, carefully, like someone was testing it. I stayed completely still, my eyes locked on the door. After a while, the footsteps retreated. I waited another hour before moving. At dawn, I went outside. More prints, the same pattern. I knew I had to get out of there, even if it meant walking. I packed a bag with essentials: water, a flashlight, food, the axe, and started walking down the road I'd come in on. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone following me, but I never did. After a few miles, my phone finally got 1 bar of service. I called for help and managed to get through to the local sheriff's office. They picked me up about an hour later. I told them everything. They sent someone to check the cabin, but when they got there was no sign of anyone else. The footprints were gone. They said they'd keep an eye on the area, but there wasn't much they could do. I went home the next day and never looked back. Weeks passed, then months. Life started to return to normal, but I never stopped thinking about that cabin, about those footprints, about the person, because it had to be a person who had been walking around in the woods watching me. The owner of the cabin later told me they found signs of someone camping deep in the woods behind the property. An old sleeping bag, empty cans, even some makeshift tools. Probably someone living off-grid, they said. Maybe not dangerous, just a drifter. But I knew better. That person had been watching me, walking around while I slept, trying the door. They waited until they thought I was alone, isolated, trapped. Maybe they were just testing how far they could go. Maybe they were planning something worse. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. But I'm just glad I trusted my gut and got out when I did. I don't go to remote cabins anymore. I still love the woods, but I stay in places with locks, neighbors, and working cars. And I never sleep with my back to the door. I'd been renting cabins off-grid for years. Whenever life in the city started to grind me down more than usual, it was my way of disconnecting. I'd go alone always. No friends, no family, no signal. I never saw the point in dragging anyone else along when the whole purpose was to get away from everyone. This time, I found a listing for a cabin about 3 hours north of where I lived. The pictures made it look basic but clean. No internet, no cell service, just a wood stove, a single bed, and a tiny kitchen. The guy who owned it only asked for a week's rent up front, paid through an app. No fuss. He sent me an access code for the front lockbox and GPS coordinates. That was it. The cabin wasn't listed on any map apps, but I figured that was part of the charm. I drove up on a Monday morning in late September. It was that kind of season where the trees were still mostly green but had started getting patches of orange and yellow. The air had a bite to it, enough that I had to keep a hoodie on when I got out to stretch. The last 30 miles or so were all back roads, narrow and cracked, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. I didn't see another vehicle once I turned off the main road. The GPS took me deep into a forest that got thicker with each mile. After about 45 minutes of driving through winding gravel trails, the signal dropped entirely. I kept going based on the downloaded coordinates, and eventually, after one final bend, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. No other houses. No roads beyond the one I came in on. Just woods in every direction. The place looked smaller than the photos made it seem, but not in a bad way. Cozy. One story, with wood siding that looked weathered but solid. There was a tiny porch, a fire pit out front with a few chopped logs stacked nearby, and a metal chimney poking out of the roof. It looked like exactly what I needed. I parked just off the dirt driveway, got out, and stood there for a minute, just listening. The only sound was wind moving through the trees. No traffic, no buzzing of electronics, just quiet. I went up the steps, found the lockbox beside the door, punched in the code, and took out the key. Inside, the place was even more stripped down than I'd expected. One open room, really, except for a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a curtain for a shower. There was a propane tank behind the place connected to a small stove and a heater. The main room had a twin bed against the far wall, a table and 2 chairs, a metal sink with a foot pump for water, and some basic shelves stocked with canned food and cooking tools. A little lantern-style lamp sat on the nightstand. It all looked fine, basic but clean, lived in but not messy. There was no clock, no TV, no radio, just a window on each wall and a small skylight overhead. The air inside had that dusty, piney scent I always associated with real cabins. Felt good to be there, safe in a way. I spent the rest of the day unpacking, chopping a bit of wood for the fire pit, and walking a loop around the clearing. The forest was thick, but not impossible to navigate, and I always kept a compass on me just in case. I didn't plan to go far anyway, just enough to stretch my legs. There were no trails that I could see, and I didn't see any signs of recent human activity. No footprints, no trash, no old fire rings. Nothing. That night, I sat by the fire with a book, wrapped in a blanket. It got dark fast out there, pitch black, with no street lights or even stars after the clouds rolled in. You forget how deep darkness can get when you live around city lights. I turned in around 10, locked the door, and slept harder than I had in months. The second day was more of the same. Making breakfast, reading, walking, chopping more wood. I barely thought about home, which was the whole point. I remember that day being especially still. The kind of still where you notice every squirrel, every snapping twig, every gust of wind through the branches. I didn't see any large animals, but I heard something big moving through the trees at one point, probably a deer or a moose. That was common up there. That night, though, something woke me up. I didn't have a clock, but I figured it was around 2 or 3 in the morning. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling that something had changed. I'd slept with the window open a crack for air, and I remember it being too quiet outside. No bugs, no wind, not even the usual creaking of the trees. Just total silence. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, then another, like someone walking slowly across the gravel outside. I sat up in bed and stayed completely still. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight coming through the window. I didn't move for what felt like 5 straight minutes. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe just a branch that fell. But the sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stood by the door, not breathing. I didn't want to turn on the light. I didn't want to make noise. I waited until the steps stopped. Then I counted to 100 before slowly turning the deadbolt and opening the door just a crack. Nothing. The clearing looked empty. The fire pit was dark. The logs I'd stacked were undisturbed. I scanned the treeline with the flashlight but saw nothing out of place. Eventually, I shut the door, locked it again, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something odd near the edge of the woods. About 30 feet from the cabin, a single pine branch had been jammed into the ground vertically. Not broken off and dropped, but stuck deep enough into the dirt that it stood upright. That wasn't there the day before. I was sure of it. It was like a marker or a sign. I looked around for tracks, but the ground was covered in needles and leaves, so there wasn't much to go on. I pulled the branch out and tossed it aside, trying not to let my imagination take over. Maybe it was a natural thing. Maybe the wind had pushed it down that way. But in my gut, I didn't buy that. The rest of that day, I kept closer to the cabin. I didn't hike. I didn't even read. I just kept looking out the windows, listening, waiting for something else to happen. Around sunset, I noticed something else. Small rocks had been placed in a neat line near the base of one of the trees, right near the edge of the clearing. For stones, evenly spaced. They weren't there before. Now I was certain someone else was out there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window with the lantern low, a hatchet resting on the table next to me. Every little sound made my heart jump. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone, how long it would take for anyone to reach me if something went wrong. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to disappear out here. Just before dawn, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. Just a small tap, then another, like pebbles being thrown. I jumped up and flicked the flashlight toward the window, but of course, I couldn't see anything out there, just my own reflection in the glass. I waited until full light before opening the door. Outside, I found a single stone resting on the porch railing. Clean, round like a river rock. It hadn't been there before. That's when I decided I had to leave. I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything back in my duffel, grabbed the cooler, locked the door behind me out of habit, and got in the car. I backed down the trail faster than I should have, tires kicking up gravel, and didn't stop until I had signal again. But the weirdest part happened after I got home. I opened my phone, went to the cabin's listing, and it was gone. Completely removed. No record of the host, no listing, no address. Just vanished. I searched the GPS coordinates again on my laptop and tried to pull up a satellite view of the clearing. But what showed up instead was uninterrupted forest. No cabin, no driveway, no clearing. I know what I saw. I know I stayed there. But according to every map I checked, nothing had ever been built there. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was just a mistake. Maybe the place was old, abandoned, never formally documented. Maybe I just spooked myself out. But 2 weeks later, a package showed up at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a small box filled with rocks. 4 of them, clean, round, neatly arranged in a line. That's when I knew someone had followed me home, and I haven't gone off-grid since. I drove up to the cabin in late October, about a week before Halloween. I'd been needing time off for months, and when my cousin mentioned his friend had a place he never used up north, I took the offer without thinking too much about it. The guy only wanted me to bring my own supplies and clean up a bit while I stayed. I liked the sound of that, just me and a few quiet days off the grid. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, about 15 miles off the nearest state road, surrounded by woods that stretched for miles in every direction. The gravel path that led up to it was rough, winding through trees that were already half bare. The sky had that dull, gray look to it, like it was stuck between rain and cold. The place itself was small, 2 rooms and a porch, wood-paneled, with a rusted-out tin roof and moss creeping up one side. There was an old shed out back, half-collapsed, and a narrow trail that led off into the woods. I parked beside a stack of chopped wood and started unloading. Inside, the cabin was musty but not terrible. A cot, a table, a little stove, and a shelf full of old books. No electricity or running water, just a rain barrel outside and a few lanterns inside. I set up my food, stacked some kindling by the stove, and sat on the front steps for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet, not a peaceful kind of quiet, more like the air was holding its breath. It was on my second day that I saw the dog. I'd gone out early to collect some fallen branches for the stove and was about 30 yards behind the cabin when I saw it, just standing there between 2 trees. It wasn't close, maybe 100 feet, but close enough for me to see it wasn't a stray or a pet. It was too big for that, with a thick coat that looked patchy and dark. It didn't bark, didn't move, just stared. I watched it for maybe a minute. Then I shouted and waved my arm. It didn't run. It just turned around and walked into the woods, slow like it wasn't in a hurry. I waited a bit, then went back inside. That night, I kept thinking about the dog. It hadn't looked sick, but there was something off about it. The way it stared, the way it moved. I kept the fire going low and laid down on the cot with my headlamp on, trying to read but not really absorbing anything. I didn't sleep much. Every little crack or shift in the wood made me open my eyes and listen. In the morning, I went out and walked the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't see anything at first. Then I found tracks. Not a lot, just a few, but fresh. Dog prints, big ones, leading from the woods to the backside of the cabin and looping around toward the trail. There were no prints going back into the woods, just those, as if it had walked in and vanished. The rest of the day was quiet, but I couldn't stop checking the windows. I kept feeling like something was just beyond the trees, just out of sight. I didn't go far from the cabin after that. Around dusk, I saw the dog again. This time it was closer, maybe 60 feet from the porch, standing in the same rigid position, watching me. I stood up and gripped the edge of the railing. It didn't move. I grabbed a piece of firewood and threw it. It landed a good 10 feet short, but the dog didn't even flinch, just turned and walked off again. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the knob, even though the door didn't really lock well to begin with. I kept the lantern low and stayed up, staring out the front window. I must have dozed off sometime after midnight because I woke up to a soft scratching sound. I held still. It was faint, like claws dragging slowly across wood. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I didn't move again until daylight started to show through the trees. In the morning, I went around the cabin. There were scratches, high up, near the window frame. Not deep, but clearly made by something sharp. I took a long breath and walked the trail that ran behind the cabin, mostly to clear my head. The trees were tighter that way, and it felt colder than it had the day before. I didn't go far, maybe a quarter mile, before I turned around. On the way back, I saw more tracks. Not old ones. These were fresh. That night, I was on edge the second the sun started to set. I brought in more wood, boiled water for coffee even though I didn't feel like drinking anything, and kept my flashlight in my hand. I sat at the table, staring at the door. Just after midnight, the scratching came again. Same spot, same slow drag. I didn't move. A few minutes later, it stopped. Then I heard breathing, not loud but close, right against the wall. I didn't even get up. I stayed there until the sky lightened. When I finally stepped outside, I found more tracks circling the cabin. But something had changed. They weren't all dog prints anymore. Some looked wrong. Too long in the toes, too narrow, like they'd been dragged. The next day was the last straw. I went out to get more water from the rain barrel and found something sitting beside it. A dead rabbit. Not just dead, mangled. Torn open down the middle like something had clawed through it slowly. There were more of those strange prints in the mud around it. I dumped the water, went inside, and packed everything up. I was done. Before I left, I checked the truck. No damage. Nothing missing. I loaded up and took one last walk around the place just to be sure I wasn't imagining all of this. And then I saw it on the porch, right where I'd been sitting the night before. The dog. It was lying down, front paws out, just staring. Not growling, not moving. I stopped in my tracks, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't move. It didn't move. I stood there for probably 2 minutes, then slowly backed toward the truck. I got in, turned the engine, and drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I went to clean the windshield and noticed something smeared on the side window. For streaks, like from an animal's paw, but too long, too even, like fingers. I never went back to that cabin. I told my cousin it was fine, left it at that. But every once in a while, I still hear that slow scratching in my dreams. Still see that dog, still remember the way it looked at me. Not hungry, not scared, just patient, like it was waiting for something. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a dog. And I think it knew I knew that too. It was early November when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin my uncle used to own up in the northern woods. He passed away years ago, and no one had touched the place since. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a small, weathered structure deep in the forest, about 45 minutes from the closest paved road. I had found the old key in one of my dad's drawers, and I figured it'd be a good escape for a while. No work, no emails, no calls. Just quiet. I brought enough supplies to last the week. Canned food, bottled water, a few jugs of gas, a camping stove just in case the propane heater didn't work, and a shotgun I kept in my truck. Not that I planned to use it, but you never know that far out. The drive up was long and mostly through dirt trails, thick with trees on either side. It had rained a few days earlier, so the road was rutted and slick. My truck handled it fine, but I had to take it slow. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that had already dropped most of their leaves. It looked just like I remembered it from when I was a kid. Dark wood siding, a sagging porch, and a chimney that tilted just slightly to one side. I parked, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute with the windows down. It was so quiet you could hear the wind moving through the branches like a whisper. No birds, no animals, just the trees and the wind. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. I opened a few windows to air it out and set about cleaning enough space to move around. There was no electricity, no running water, never had been. The outhouse sat a few yards behind the cabin, tilted and graying. The heater was old but worked after a little coaxing. Once the place warmed up, I laid out my sleeping bag on the old couch and lit a few candles. I didn't have much planned. Read some books, hike a little, just clear my head. The first day and night were uneventful. I heard some movement outside once, maybe a deer or raccoon, but nothing unusual. The forest had a way of making you feel like you were being watched even when you knew you weren't. I chalked it up to the usual woods paranoia. I've camped alone plenty of times before and figured it'd pass. The second day, I decided to hike out past the ridge behind the cabin. There was an old trail there that my uncle used to take me down when I was little. It was mostly overgrown, but I still found my way along it. About an hour in, I came across a broken-down hunting blind, just a few rotted boards nailed into a tree. Nearby were some rusted beer cans and an old tarp, half buried under leaves. Looked like someone had used the area at some point, maybe years ago. That night, I kept waking up. The wind had picked up and kept slapping a loose shutter against the window frame. I got up to latch it, and while I was standing there, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks had been stacked neatly in front of the steps. 4 of them, flat stones balanced carefully. I hadn't noticed them earlier that day. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming maybe they'd always been there and I just didn't remember. I kicked them over and went back inside. On the third day, I felt a little uneasy. Not scared, just a bit off, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I took a walk again, this time in a different direction. There wasn't much to see, just more trees, fallen branches, the occasional squirrel or bird. I ended up back at the cabin after a few hours. That's when I noticed the back door was open. I hadn't used it. I was sure I hadn't. The latch was old but still worked, and I knew I'd locked it. Nothing inside seemed touched. I checked everything. My food, gear, even my truck, but nothing was missing. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I closed the door and slid the bolt across it. That night, the wind died down. It was dead still outside. No creaks, no rustling, nothing. I sat by the small wood stove, reading with my flashlight until the batteries started to fade. I climbed into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I kept hearing small noises. Not animals, not wind, something else. Light footsteps, maybe, twigs snapping softly. I told myself it was just the forest settling, maybe a raccoon digging around. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was a thud, dull and heavy, like something hitting the porch steps. I held my breath and listened. Another thud, then silence. I grabbed the shotgun and moved to the front window, peeking out between the curtain and the frame. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark. I waited for a long time, not moving, listening. Eventually, I must have drifted off sitting up because I woke with the early light streaming through the window. The next morning, I went outside and saw what had made the noise. Another pile of stones, this one larger than before. 6 rocks, stacked in a spiral shape right in front of the door. My boot prints from the day before were still there, and around them, fresh prints I didn't recognize. Barefoot, The dirt was damp enough that the impressions were clear. No shoes, just toes and heels. Someone walking right up to my cabin barefoot in the cold. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The prints came from the woods and went back into them. No sign of whoever made them. I followed them for a bit but lost them about 30 yards in where the leaves and pine needles covered the ground. I stood there for a long time just listening. Again, nothing. Not even birds. I thought about leaving that day, but part of me didn't want to give in to whatever this was. Maybe some hiker messing around, though it didn't make sense to walk around barefoot out here. I loaded the shotgun and kept it close the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every sound felt amplified. A branch snapping made me jump. I kept looking at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there. I kept the shotgun across my lap while I sat in the corner with a candle burning low. Nothing happened, but I felt the pressure of being watched the entire time. When the sun finally came up, I decided to pack up and leave. It had gone from a relaxing trip to something else entirely. I gathered my things, locked the cabin, and walked to the truck. That's when I saw the last pile of rocks. This one wasn't like the others. It was right next to the driver's side door, stacked higher, maybe 10 stones, and on top, something that made my stomach drop. One of my shotgun shells, just sitting there like a message. I hadn't left any shells outside. I kept them in a box inside my pack. I opened the pack and checked. The box was there, but one was missing. Someone had been inside while I slept. That meant they'd stepped right past me within feet and taken it without waking me up. I got in the truck and started it, locking the doors even though I was already leaving. I drove out faster than I should have, bouncing over roots and rocks, scraping the undercarriage more than once. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. When I got home, I called the local sheriff's office, told them someone might have been on the property. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't push it. I didn't want to go back. Months went by. Life returned to normal. But every now and then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something. Sometimes I'd dream of the cabin, the silence, the stones, the bare footprints in the cold. I never told anyone the full story. Sounds too strange, too paranoid. But I haven't gone into the woods alone since. I still have the shotgun, and I still count the shells every single night. It was late autumn when I decided to take some time off and head up into the mountains. I had rented this small, remote cabin that was a few hours' drive away from the nearest town. It was tucked away in a thick pocket of forest, well off the grid. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no roads leading in. Just a rough path a car could barely manage. That's exactly what I was looking for. I wanted silence, distance from everyone, and the kind of quiet that creeps into your bones. The cabin wasn't much. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed against the wall. There was a small kitchenette, an old propane fridge, and a pantry that hadn't been used in years. I brought everything I needed in a few boxes: food, water, firewood, and a few comforts like coffee and a thick sleeping bag. I had no plans for adventure. I just wanted to be alone. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent time reading, going for short hikes, gathering wood. The temperature dropped at night, dipping close to freezing, so I kept the stove running. The woods were quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it was unsettling at times. No wind, no birds, no animals moving through the brush. Just the occasional creak of the trees swaying and the crack of firewood. It was the 4th night when something changed. I had gone to bed around 9 p.m. and let the fire die down. I was used to the darkness by now, used to the sounds of the forest, or the lack of them. But I woke up sometime in the night because of a noise I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was something falling on the roof, maybe a branch. But it happened again, and this time it sounded like it came from the side of the cabin. It was a dull, low thump, not sharp, not sudden, like something soft hitting wood. Then silence. I stayed in my sleeping bag, listening. 10 minutes went by, then another sound. A scrape this time just below the window. It wasn't wind. There was no wind. It was dead calm. I didn't want to move. My flashlight was on the table across the room, and I didn't want to fumble around and make noise. Eventually, I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I just held it and listened. More time passed. 10, 20 minutes. I must have dozed off again at some point, because when I opened my eyes next, the fire was completely out, and the cold was creeping in. I finally turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the inside of the cabin. Everything looked normal. The next morning, I walked around the outside of the cabin. The ground was hard with frost, and the leaves were stiff and dry. I looked under the windows and found what I didn't want to see. Scuff marks in the dirt. Not prints exactly, just disturbances in the leaves and soil like someone had dragged something or stood still for a long time. I brushed it off. Maybe an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear, but it didn't sit right. That afternoon, I didn't hike far. I stayed near the cabin and kept an eye on the surrounding trees. I felt watched. I can't explain why. I didn't see or hear anything, but the feeling stayed with me. It's like when you're walking alone at night and you just know someone's behind you even when you don't hear footsteps. That's what it felt like. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I set a couple of logs next to the bed so I could feed it easily. I left the flashlight within arm's reach. I even placed a pan and a metal spoon on the windowsill, thinking maybe the noise would alert me if something disturbed it. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared, but I was. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, not from a noise, but from a lack of one. The fire had died out again, and the cabin was freezing. My breath showed in the air. I sat up and listened. The silence was thick, too thick. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. Just as the beam cut across the room, I heard it. Another soft thud on the far wall, followed by a faint dragging sound. This time, I got up. I pulled my boots on without tying them and went to the door. I opened it slowly and aimed the flashlight outside. Nothing, just woods and darkness. But then, to the right of the cabin, I saw it. Something moved. Not fast, but just enough to catch the edge of the light. I froze. I held my breath and stared. I couldn't see what it was. A shadow, maybe. A figure. It was too dark, and the flashlight wasn't strong enough. I stepped out, just far enough to hear the crunch of leaves under my boots. Whatever it was had stopped moving. I waited. Then I heard it again. A soft, low scrape, like something being pulled through the dirt. I backed into the cabin and shut the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By sunrise, I was done pretending. I packed a day's worth of supplies and decided to hike back to my car. It was a long trek, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I didn't even eat breakfast, I just left. About 20 minutes down the trail, I stopped for a break and turned back to look toward the cabin. I couldn't see it anymore. It was buried too deep in the woods, but what I did see made my stomach drop. Just off the trail, not 20 feet from where I stood, were more scuff marks in the leaves. Fresh ones. Whatever had been near the cabin had followed me. Or maybe it had been ahead of me and doubled back. I didn't stop again. I kept moving, faster than I should have, barely watching where I stepped. I just wanted to reach the car. I didn't see or hear anything else for the rest of the hike, but I never shook the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. When I finally made it to the car, I didn't even bother changing out of my hiking boots. I just threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and drove until I was back on paved roads. I didn't feel relief until I was in town, sitting in a gas station parking lot with a hot coffee in my hands. I never went back to that cabin. I never contacted the owner or asked for a refund. I didn't want to know what had been out there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was tired and my mind played tricks on me. But the marks in the leaves, the sounds on the wall, the shadow in the trees, they weren't in my head. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see, just to know for sure. But I never do. I've stayed in cabins since, but never that deep in the woods, and never alone. That trip changed how I see the wilderness. It's not just the beauty and the peace. It's the silence, the isolation, and the way you can be completely alone but still not safe. I still love the woods, but I keep my distance now. Some places are better left alone. I don't know if I'll ever go back to the mountains after what happened last fall. I had rented a small cabin by myself deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The plan was to stay for a full week, just to disconnect. No phone, no internet, no people. Just a wood-burning stove, a creek nearby, and a lot of quiet. It sounded perfect. The cabin was about a 40-minute drive from the nearest town, and the last few miles were on a dirt road that twisted through thick pines and firs. I had to park about 50 yards away and walk the rest of the way in because the path was too narrow and overgrown for my car. It was one of those old hunting cabins, no electricity, just a small propane tank for cooking and a wood stove for heat. There was a hand pump for water out back and an outhouse about 20 feet into the trees. The place had seen better days, but it was solid and dry. My first 2 days were peaceful. I chopped wood, hiked a bit, sat by the creek, and cooked over the propane stove. I read a lot and slept even more. The silence was almost overwhelming at first, but I started to settle into it. At night, I'd light some candles, warm up the place with a fire, and fall asleep to the crackling of logs. But on the third night, something changed. I had just put out the candles and crawled into the cot, which I had stacked with thick sleeping bags and blankets. I remember hearing what I thought was a distant snapping sound, like a stick breaking, but I figured it was just some animal. Still, I felt uneasy. It was the kind of feeling that crawls up the back of your neck when you know you're not really alone. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to noises. Faint rustling outside, a soft scraping against the wall, once even what sounded like a low thud near the back of the cabin. I stayed completely still each time, holding my breath, staring into the dark. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet and a long knife I used for chopping food. I kept the knife close that night. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. Nothing looked out of place at first, but when I got to the back, I saw something strange. One of the wooden panels near the bottom of the wall had a crack in it, and the dirt beneath it looked like it had been disturbed. I crouched down and brushed it away. It was definitely dug out, like someone or something had tried to crawl under the cabin. The hole wasn't big, maybe 8 inches across, but it was too clean and too fresh to be random. I filled it back in and tried not to think much about it. I told myself it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon or fox, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That whole day, I kept feeling like I was being watched. I'd turn around while gathering wood or filling water, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. That night, I decided to stay awake for a while, just to see if the noises came back. I didn't light the candles. I just sat near the stove with the fire going low and the knife across my lap. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It was faint, a soft shuffle of dirt or leaves, then another closer. I blew out the fire, sat in total darkness, and listened. Something was out there, no question. It moved slowly, with long pauses, like it was checking its surroundings or trying not to be heard. I thought about calling out, but I knew that would be a mistake. The sound circled the cabin. Once, it stopped just outside the back wall where the hole had been. I held my breath and sat frozen. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I went outside immediately. There were footprints, bare human footprints in the dirt. They weren't big, but they were unmistakably human. The prints led from the edge of the woods to the back wall, and then around the cabin. I followed them about 30 feet into the trees before they just stopped. That day, I packed. I knew I wasn't staying another night, but my car battery was dead. I don't know how, it was fine when I got there and I hadn't used it. I tried to jump it with my backup battery pack, but nothing worked. I was stuck, and there was no cell signal. I had 2 choices: hike the 40 minutes back to town through the woods or stay another night and try again in the morning. I chose to stay. I reinforced the door with extra wood, nailed some planks across the inside, and blocked the windows as best I could. I built a fire early and kept the knife and hatchet close. When night came, I stayed by the fire and waited. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling the cabin. I stayed completely silent. Then something new. A knock. One single knock, dead center on the door. Not loud, Not aggressive, just a knock. I didn't move. After a minute, another knock. Then silence. I waited hours, barely breathing, heart pounding in my ears. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to light peeking through the boards. I ran outside. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anything. My car still wouldn't start. I didn't waste any more time. I packed a small bag and started walking. I didn't even lock the cabin. The walk back was the longest of my life. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, nothing was there. When I finally made it to the ranger station just outside town, I must have looked like hell. The ranger drove me back to my car later that day, and of course, it started right up. No issue at all. I didn't say anything about what happened. I just thanked him and drove home. I haven't gone back since, and I won't. I still think about that knock sometimes. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to break in. It wanted me to know it was there. It wanted to be seen or heard. I live in the city now. I lock every door and window, even during the day. I don't go hiking anymore, and I haven't been camping since. I miss the quiet, but not enough to risk hearing that knock again. That wasn't the woods. That was someone who knew I was alone. Someone who watched me for days. Someone who waited. That's what keeps me up now. The waiting, because I think whoever it was might not have stayed in those woods.